Good evening. My name is Hollis Brookover. I'm a board member at the Frank Church Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our Frank Church Society event. The Frank Church Society operates under the auspices of the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. Its mission is to create opportunities for the public to engage in interactive, nonpartisan discussions with experts on a broad range of issues that were important to the late senator and continue to be vital today. Today's conversation promises to meet all those criteria. We are joined by Joe Weisberg, Emmy Award winner, co-creator of the TV series The Americans, and author of the new book, Russia Upside Down. The first segment of our program will focus on the series. Joining Joe for an insider's look into his journey and the making of a successful television series is Ann Blanchard, senior packaging agent at CAA in Los Angeles, where Joe is represented. Ann and I first met at Smith College in 1978. She's an outstanding agent and one of the best read people I know. She's a big fan of Joe and is sure to have some interesting insights and questions for him. The second segment will be led by Steve Feldstein, Frank Church Institute board member and senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. We were so fortunate to have been able to recruit Steve 6 years ago to be the first chair of the Frank Church Institute. He came to us from the State Department and took us to new heights. Steve has a wealth of knowledge and experience in foreign policy and will expertly guide the discussion of Joe's book and a deeper dive into U.S.-Russia relations. I'd like to encourage the audience to submit your questions in the chat option. We'll do our best to allow time for answers to those questions at the end of the program. Let's run a little clip and then turn it over to Ann.
Well, if there is a war, we might have fired the first shot.
If there is a war, we're not the ones who started it.
We just killed a security guard down the street from a Secretary of Defense. We're riding around with enough explosives to blow up half the government buildings in D.C. We're mapping sniper shots to take out key U.S. leadership. If anyone's escalating things, it's us.
I'm not making the decisions.
No, but you agree with them.
I think the Americans are capable of anything. Do you listen to what they say about us?
Do you listen to yourself when you talk about them?
What is that supposed to mean?
Nothing. Forget it.
Hi, guys. I'm having trouble hearing.
I can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Hi, Joe. Hello, everybody. I wasn't sure if I could be heard. This is such a pleasure. And Joe, I really sit here as your representative, but also on behalf of Joe Cohen, who's been your agent for many years, just to say what a huge fan I am of yours, what a huge fan I am of the Americans, of your partner Joel Fields, who I think is amazing, and really all you accomplished. But truthfully, when I got to, and I don't want to steal from Steve's portion, but when I got to the book over the holiday and read it in one sitting, I was like, wow, the idea of taking your inner sort of passion for Russia and translating that into a hit television show was something I wasn't even aware of. And just so you know, Joe Cohen, who is truly my boss at CAA and has represented Joe for years and is one of probably the premier agent in the world of television, he said to me, well, tell Joe that if I'd known years before that he was that passionate about Russia, we would have done The Americans in 2000 instead of 2013.
That's very funny. Well,
so
it's just a funny thing because if you work in Hollywood, one of the things is agents, make everything happen, but then sort of stay in the background so they don't get talked about that much. They like to let other people have the glory. But, my whole career exists because Joe Cohen called me one day on the phone and Joe and Ann worked at a place called CAA, which I'd never heard of. I didn't know what CAA was. I was probably, everybody in Hollywood knows what it is, but I didn't. And Joe called, he said, I'm an agent at CAA and I read your book and I wonder have you ever thought about writing for television? And that was the start of my whole career. So he's the reason there is The Americans.
Well, and why don't you mention what that book was, since obviously it was different from the one that we're discussing tonight.
Which book?
Well, the book that Joe read.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah. So, I worked for a few years at the CIA in my mid 20s. And after I left, I was a writer. I'd been writing my whole life, but I wasn't going to write about it because I was in this sort of secretive culture and I thought all my friends there would be pissed off. And so I just laid low for about 10 years. And then after about a decade, I woke up one morning and thought I could write about it. You know, I know all this interesting stuff about intelligence. And by the way, you're allowed to write about it. You have to send anything you write into the CIA and they have to approve it, but it's not against the rules. So I wrote a spy novel called An Ordinary Spy, and it was about a young case officer who goes abroad and has all kinds of adventures. And that was the book that made its way to Joe Cohen's desk.
I love that. Well, let's dive into a few questions about the Americans and a little bit about your origin story. And at the end, I'd love for you to give the audience a taste for your new series coming up with Steve Carell, which is called The Patient. Spoiler alert, I think that one's going to be amazing also. So, Joe, your accomplishments on this show are legendary. Multiple Emmys, Golden Globes, acclaim even from the geopolitical community. The Homeland writers always say that, and directors who we work with always say that The Americans is the only other show that got it right. So big
Very nice.
kudos to
Yeah.
you from people in the community. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how your early fascination with Russia developed and how does that kind of combine with your own origin story and what really led you to be, first of all, a spy and then a storyteller. And how did those two things kind of overlap for you?
It's funny because there's so many different elements there that by the time you're done, it's really almost my whole life. My whole life we're talking about. But when I was pretty young, when I was still in high school, I got very fascinated with Russia and with the Soviet Union in particular. Part of that was reading certain books and my father reading books to me, a lot of great old Russian literature. And part of it was that I was growing up in the 70s. I mean, I was born in 1965, so I was sort of coming of age in the 70s, and everybody was obsessed with the Soviet Union. It was what we talked about and what we worried about and what we stressed about and what we argued about, what we fought about. But the most interesting thing that might be hard for people in our sort of polarized America today who are younger to understand is that most everybody agreed, right? There was really a
Yes.
broad bipartisan consensus that the Soviet Union was our enemy and that they were, sort of evil, or as Ronald Reagan put it, the evil empire, and we were the good guys and they were the bad guys. And it was very, everybody agreed almost, so there wasn't much to like really argue with or think about. I agreed too. If they were the bad guys, we were the good guys, and I was a good guy. I was on the right team. It sort of felt good. So I went on to college. I started studying Soviet history. I loved hearing about I basically loved hearing about all the horrible things that happened there. I loved reading about Stalin and the Gulag and the famines because every bit of it made me think we would never do that. We're so good. We're so righteous. We have to be careful of look how horrible they are. I mean, it was like a fetish almost. I think I wrote in my book that I hated the Soviet Union, but I loved it. Right? I loved it. So, in a way, the kind of person I was, I needed something to do with that. It wasn't enough to just think about it or talk about it. I wanted to take action. I wanted to play a role in fighting the Soviet Union. And that's what led me to the CIA.
Very interesting. I too, you're going to laugh, but when I started reading your book, I was like, oh my gosh, I too had that early Russia fascination. I went to Russia in the 1980s. So with my college, and there really was a Kalashnikov on every corner. But, and this is to the point of your new book, is that those were all 18-year-old kids who were flirting with us. So they were holding the evil instrument of death, but they were really concerned about where we were all going to find morozhnaya, which was Russian for ice cream. So I really felt that myself. And I grew up on Chekhov and Nabokov, and that was very much my parents' fascination, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. So I really got to say, we're going to have lunch later and just geek out on Russia. But I found it very interesting that you touch on the idea of sort of what is this more self-aware look at politics? How did that sort of concept perhaps start with your choosing to do The Americans around an arranged marriage?
I think
And
what
I
I have
know
to
that's
say is
something
that,
that Joel Fields, your partner, has referred to a lot, is writing about a marriage, not just a geopolitical dilemma. But go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, yeah, for sure. The show was always about a marriage. I mean, that was the emotional core of the show. It was not really a show about espionage. It was a show about a family that was engaged in espionage and about a romance and a marriage and parenting in that situation. When I was at the CIA, I worked with a lot of people who lied to their kids about what they did. And generally, people didn't
Uh,
lie forever, but they lied until their kids were old enough to keep a secret. Because if they were working abroad and they said to their kids, I work for the CIA, a 10-year-old might go to school and tell everybody. And then your cover is blown. So it was a really complicated thing inside families, and different families handled it differently, and different kids responded to it differently. But it seemed like something, if you wanted to make a show about espionage and a marriage and a family, that seemed like it could be the whole core right there almost, just that the kids didn't know, and would they ever find out? So, I think Joel and I really connected on that. I was probably a little more interested in the spying part, and we were kind of equally interested in the marriage part. But as the years of the show went on, I got a little bored of the spying part too. So we really, it was easy. It was hard to sort of keep the spying part from becoming repetitive, even though I thought there was really interesting material there. But a complicated marriage, I mean, if you've been in one, that can be repetitive too. But it never stops being fascinating.
exactly. I love that. I also was fascinating reading about your being inspired by the episode with the illegals. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about that and how that played out for you in the development of the show?
Well, it's getting to be a while ago now, so people may not all remember, but in 2010, a group of Russian spies were arrested in the United States. And what was interesting about it was that they were a very special kind of spy referred to as illegals. And they're illegals because they were here illegally. A lot of spies are actually wherever they are, it's not illegal. They're sort of under various types of, they have various jobs that they're allowed to do in that country, and everybody may even suspect who they are. But first the Soviets and later the Russians put a lot of resources into sending spies into countries where they would then pretend to be citizens of that country. So the 10 who were arrested in the United States, quite most of them were pretending to be American citizens, and they had these complicated cover stories, and they'd taken the identities of dead people, and they had all documents and everything else. So their neighbors all thought that they were American citizens, and they had various excuses to explain for most of them why they had these kind of vague Eastern European accents, but that's not that uncommon in America either. So when they were arrested, I got a call from a couple guys over at DreamWorks Television who said, you should do a TV show based on this. And I said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. And I started thinking about it. And the main problem was that in 2010, we weren't having trouble with Russia, really. It seemed weird that they were spying on us in that way. And who cared? We weren't really in conflict. So I decided I'd move it back to the Cold War and the Reagan era. And then it got really interesting. And as I was saying previously, the sort of, the idea of a marriage and a family seemed like the way to sort of get to the emotional core of it. But that was 100% the inspiration. It later turned out that the family itself bore some resemblance to one of the actual families, which I don't think I realized at the time. And I've subsequently also very slightly, but just a little bit, gotten to know the father in that family too. And he gave the show probably the biggest compliment it ever got, which was, he said, look, all the killing and the stuff like that, that's crazy. Obviously, we didn't do any of that. But the emotional dynamics of the show really captured what my family experienced. So that was a nice compliment.
That's fascinating. Just because the rise of television as the primary storytelling tool, it sounds like you and I really grew up, as did Hollis and many others, on novels. But and also true stories, but there's something about the brilliantly arced novel. I really felt about the series that it had that sense of the arc. Did you and Joel know in advance with your staff where you were going to take it over 6 seasons?
It's interesting. Joel and I talked about this all the time. I mean, it was a constant subject for us. And I think we had two feelings. One was that pretty early on, like by the second season, we had come up with an ending that we thought was good, but we didn't expect it to hold, because the other thing was that we were big believers that to get really good stories, we had to be open to whatever happened spontaneously. So if we would, with our staff, if we would plan a season of stories and where everything was going to go and the characters and everything else, and then as we were writing one of the scripts or working more on one of the stories, a new idea came up and it was a really good idea. You don't want to shut that idea down because it's going to divert you from your plan. If you do that, you're going to end up with just the plan. And it's never going to be as good because you've rejected then all the good ideas that don't fit. So we would follow the things that we thought were best ideas, and they would take you all over the place. You would almost never end up where you started or where you thought you were going to go. So the fact that we kind of ended up the end of the whole series did end up where we thought it would go in season 2 was a little bit of a miracle.
I love that. Again, we're sort of addressing process in television because I find more and more people are interested behind the scenes. I love that you as a novelist, and it's really a measure of, I think, what cable and streaming is able to do now, that you're able to follow the impulse of the story as opposed to what networks used to do, as you recall, with the 5-act structure. You always know what it's going to be. You know what the beats are going to be. You know what the limitations of character are. I just think that's really fantastic. And that novelistic kind of storytelling is so evident in the Americans. So FX, and I just want the audience to understand that when we take high-level writers like Joe Weisberg out projects, we're very careful to evaluate who runs point at various networks and what their level of fascination is with different kinds of storytelling and how sophisticated they are. You had a unique partnership. You've always had a unique partnership with John Landgraf, who runs FX. Just tell the audience a little bit about that partnership and how that's distinct from the rest of the 10, 12, 14 places we all sell television shows.
I had developed a previous show about a CIA station in Bulgaria, and I sold it to FX, and that's how I first got to know John and his team there. And although they didn't make that show, we went through a fairly lengthy process of developing it, writing a script, rewriting a script. And I got to, Joe Cohen taught me how to develop a TV show. But then the group at FX really taught me how to take the next step and really how to take the next steps with it. And it was such a great experience because they're very unique there. First of all, they're, so good at making television, and they're so interested in making things that are deep and resonant and that they care about. And so I don't just mean, part of that is that if you come up with great complicated stuff, they embrace that. But they also help you figure out how to do it and have their own ideas that are really good. People who work at other places often sort of dread the notes they get from the network. But if you're working at FX, you look forward to the notes because your show is going to get better. So that's how I first kind of connected with them. And then I came back to do The American. So we already had a relationship. And, coming from writing novels, the thing that was so new to me was that it's a collaborative process, right? You write novels, you sit in a room by yourself and you do it by yourself. And maybe at the end you get some good help from an editor, which can be helpful. But it's really a solitary endeavor. TV, it's a whole team. It's a huge number of people, even in the writing and even in the planning. And certainly then it just gets bigger as you go. If the show gets ordered, then a huge team producing it and directors and actors. And anyway, the executives at FX are a pretty special breed. And they were the only ones who wanted to do The Americans. They were only ones, the idea of having KGB agents as the heroes turned everybody else off, and it appealed to them. They thought that's different. That's interesting. Let's do that. So I could give sort of countless examples of how great it has been to work there. And Joel is also very close to them, and it's interesting working with Joel because he'd done a lot of different kinds of television, including a lot of the kind where you're discussing earlier, where boy, every act has to be exactly this length,
Exactly.
and it has to go off on a cliffhanger, and every show has to tell a complete beginning, middle, and end. And the thing I've discovered people in old style television, I probably shouldn't call it that, but old style television complain most about is they would have to do 22 episodes a season. And they would all tell the same story that, if you're doing 22 episodes, you're always rushing so much, you never have time to make anything good. And if you get, 7 really good episodes out of your 22, you're thrilled. And also you're exhausted and ready to kill yourself by the end of the season, at which point you get like a month off and go back and do it all again. And people, it just sounds rough. And that is not the experience we had. We had the experience to really have the time to work on every script and make it better.
Well, it absolutely showed. in the storytelling. It's just an amazing accomplishment. What about casting? How was that process? And did you have Carrie and Matthew in mind from the beginning, or how did that evolve?
Well, that's a good John Landgraf story because, when we started the casting process, first of all, I said to John, what can I do? I'd never done this before, and Joel wasn't there yet when we made the pilot, so I didn't have, his more experienced hand. And I said to John, what would I do to screw this up? And he said, cast it wrong. Right? If you cast it wrong, you're just dead. So the first thing we did was cast Elizabeth, and we had this list of, 40 actors in Hollywood who were the right age and the generally right fit and whatnot. And we were sort of having this probably 10 or 15 of us on a call talking about it, thinking about it. And John just goes, Carrie Russell. And he told me later that, he said sometimes he has like just an intuition where he knows who it is. It doesn't have to happen all the time, but it happens sometimes. And I think for him, because it was so against type, she was so sort of the Felicity, and it was the opposite of Elizabeth Jennings in a lot of ways. And I didn't know her work that well, but I remember I saw the movie Waitress, and I saw the movie and it was clear. I thought she can do anything. She just seemed so incredible. So that was where that came from. And then Matthew was an idea of a casting person over at DreamWorks. And I remember Gavin O'Connor, who directed the pilot, and I went to see a play that he was in and met with them. And then he read with Carrie. And it just sort of all came together like that. Gavin, who directed it, was an old friend of Noam Emmerich and brought him in. And he was, of course, so perfect and amazing as Stan. So, I don't know, I hadn't done any casting at that point, and I was sort of, starting to learn that, it can be very intimidating, but it isn't really any kind of magic. It's really about just trusting your intuition and listening to yourself and listening to other people. By the way, it's a little more complicated if you're a director, because I think a lot of directors, for example, will work with somebody and sort of get to see in a room how they respond to direction and everything like that. But, if you're not a director, it's to a large degree about trusting yourself.
Well, she is such a delight in this role because it feels like her beautiful appearance, kind of sort of Middle American, you could almost argue, but you could certainly argue Eastern European if you want to look at it through a different lens. It just belies the grit. It belies the depth of character. I saw her in a Lanford Wilson piece, Burn This, with Adam Driver, and on Broadway, and she was spectacular. So I love that.
I saw that too.
Yeah, wasn't that a great? Yeah, excellent. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add? And I'd love for you to just mention the patient a little bit before we hand it over to Steve.
Well, I guess, Joel and I have been thinking for a long time about what our next project would be. And I guess we knew that we didn't want to do another spy show. We were both done with spies for at least a while and maybe forever. We'll see. And, we spent a long time looking. People would bring us projects. We think of things on our own. We tried a couple of things that we couldn't fully, make work. And then we just, we were both very interested in therapy. And we'd actually been thinking a lot about how could you make a drama about therapy that would be fun and interesting rather than just sort of get a little slow. I mean, by the way, I loved In Treatment, but it just probably wasn't the right thing for FX to do something like In Treatment. So anyway, we came up with this idea that if you had a serial killer and told a story about them and their therapist, that could work as a sort of dramatic engine. And it was like, we spent so much time trying to come up with an idea, but once we had that idea, it just took off, and we just figured out quickly how to turn it into a show. And we're going to start shooting that in January with Steve Carell.
It's fantastic.
As the therapist.
Steve Carell, which is huge.
Yeah.
Huge. I mean, and he's, of course, breaking new boundaries. And I think it's a perfect combination of elements. Well, let me, speaking of therapy, I love the role of therapy and personal insight in Russia Upside Down. I think I've never read a book that had a geopolitical focus that started with the idea of how can introspection change the process of spying and also the process of relating to another country. So on that note, why don't I hand it over to Steve? But this has been so wonderful, Joe, and I'm going to take you to lunch. We can talk further about Russia.
Thanks, Ann. I appreciate it. Great talking to you and nice to see you.
Thank you.
All right.
Hi,
Great.
Steve.
Well, what a fascinating conversation. It was really wrapped, especially because so much of us don't have the kind of insights in Hollywood and casting that you all have. So just hearing about how Carrie Russell was sort of, fit in to play the role that she did, and all the other aspects, I personally found it really engrossing. So
Well,
thanks
I'll
for
tell
that
you, I'll
insight.
tell you one last thing about Steve, which is that I feel like in a way Hollywood has a bad reputation. Like before I worked there, I probably didn't think much of Hollywood, but my experiences there have been amazing. Like incredibly talented, smart, good people. You know, the stereotypes when I was growing up was everybody was taking drugs and running around and acting terribly. And I have, honestly, I'm sure there's some of that, but I haven't. That is not what I've experienced. I've experienced something pretty impressive.
Well, that's gratifying to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I think there's a really like there's a stereotype about Hollywood being kind of really cutthroat and so forth. But I'm glad to hear that. So on to geopolitics and foreign policy, which is cutthroat, especially when we're dealing with someone like Putin. And our timing is really relevant right now because as we're about to engage in a discussion of your really fascinating book, Russia Upside Down, a prior guest of the Frank Church Institute, Tony Blinken, who's now Secretary of State, is about to have his own dialogue with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, tomorrow. I believe in Sweden, where he'll try to convince Lavrov that if the Russians invade Ukraine yet again, there will be severe, at least economic consequences. I'm not sure what other consequences might be on the table. So even as we're sort of talking about how do we exit from a second Cold War, it seems like we may also be entering into, in a very deeper way, this Cold War. So they obviously need to read your book as soon as possible. That's that is something that we'll have to do. But why don't we, so just for the audience, I think your book is fairly new, so a lot of folks probably haven't read it yet. But I think the idea behind the book is really to kind of question some of the kind of longstanding tropes that we've had when it comes to how we engage with U.S., Russia, and prior to that, Soviet Union relations, and the fact that I think people are so dug in to their own positions and have refused to sort of see past those perspectives that we end up kind of just essentially kind of playing to ourselves as opposed to actually thinking about constructive ways to engage. And frankly, from a foreign policy perspective, there probably is a large price to pay for those who would dare to question conventional wisdom and try to go beyond the kind of normal relations. So let me start.
So you mean people inside the establishment? You mean
Inside the
people
establishment,
could
right?
lose
If
their
you were to sort of
jobs
say,
or not progress
right,
and things. Yeah,
right, to sort of say, hey, let's do this a different way. I mean, the entire premise of your book is essentially it's a hard thing to do, to push for a counterintuitive approach, right? So, I want to approach my initial question in sort of two ways. Let me start by sort of saying, the book calls for dramatic rethinking of assumptions, and I'm curious, can you explain for the audience a little bit, how did you arrive at this premise, and how did you sort of translate that into a manuscript? It's one thing to sort of say, wait, this doesn't sit right with me. It's another thing to take the time and space and research to really dig into something in the manner in which you have. So can you give us a little insight to how you arrived at that?
You sound like someone who knows of what he speaks, right? It's like once you've made that leap of deciding to get it out of your head onto the page, you're like, that was not so easy.
Yeah, don't try it if you haven't.
Right, exactly. Or unless you're really sure you want to do it.
Right.
But
Really
I think for
masochistic.
me, exactly. I think the impetus for me was that I had my own pretty intense experience of reevaluating what I believed in the political realm, specifically about the Soviet Union. And as I was discussing with Anne a little bit, I was brought up in America in the 70s, and for many reasons became a very intense Cold Warrior. I agreed with Ronald Reagan. I thought the Soviet Union was an evil empire. I wanted to fight it. I wanted to destroy it. And some of that was because that's what our culture thought. All the messages in the movies and the novels and the nightly news and the newspaper and everything was just about how awful they were. And it was sort of, I think, sort of unintentionally designed to bring Americans together in this common perception that we were the good guys and they were the bad guys. But what happened to me is a lot of things then came together much later to cause me to rethink the whole thing. And part of it is I went to therapy and I started just sort of expanding my way of looking at everything. I became a less black and white thinker. I became a less rigid thinker in general. And then that started bleeding over into my politics and my way of looking at the world. And then I both started looking for and getting exposed to alternate views of the history of the Soviet Union and what had happened, partly because I was now looking and partly because a lot more of them were coming out, right? Now that the Soviet Union had collapsed. And so I started just sucking up information that contradicted what I had thought previously. And it became relatively clear to me that the way I had looked at things, the Ronald Reagan view, was just almost ridiculously simplistic. It was almost unrelated to anything you could call a multidimensional picture. It wasn't necessarily that it was all based on lies, right? Most of the complaints we had about the Soviet Union back then, about the way they mistreated dissidents and things like that, were true. But it was not balanced by any information about good things about the Soviet Union or why there was so much popular support for the Soviet Union, at least in its early and mid stages, sort of fading later. So I reassessed the whole thing myself. And then I got interested in that. And I thought, oh, well, how do you get it so wrong? Why should you reassess it? What do you start to see? And that was really in a way that was, first of all, the impetus for the Americans, for the TV show. And then second of all, I was interested, even during the show, I started learning more and more that sort of expanded my view of this other country. And I just finally decided, as we were saying, let's see if I can get it from here onto there.
Mm-hmm. Well, so tell me a little bit about your process. So you mentioned you went to therapy, you started kind of becoming a different type of thinker. You obviously have a longstanding interest in the Soviet Union and Russia, but it's and then that kind of led into the Americans. But it's one thing to think about this; it's another thing to really put pen to paper. So I'm curious, what was the research process for you like? What was the process of inquiry beyond these different thoughts that you used as a means to develop your theory and to actually kind of bring a coherent structure to what's in the book?
I would just say, it's a funny thing to describe. I always felt that, I was a novelist, and part of the reason was that I didn't like research. I didn't want to go to a library and sit down and pore over books and take notes and then figure out how to put them into an essay. That was not appealing to me. But I was a reader. And I read this one particular book by a former KGB officer, and that was very influential because he wrote this book after the collapse of the Soviet Union, obviously. And when I read the book, I really related to him. Him and his friends at the KGB sounded a lot like me and my friends at the CIA. So that was so shocking to me that it drove me to read more and do more research. And I eventually got to the point where I thought, well, these are not horrible, evil assassins in the KGB. I had such a stereotype view of them. They're people like us. So that's sort of the idea of doing a TV show where the KGB officers were the heroes and were sympathetic made sense to me, in a sense, because of things I had read and because of things I had learned. And then in the show, I started learning more about it. I studied the Soviet war in Afghanistan a little bit. Well, we were going to do some stories about it. So I started studying it a lot. And I started reading things about how they got into Afghanistan and what the soldiers' experiences were like. And they were all different from what had been presented in the American press. Like, as an example, I remember the American press just reporting that the Soviets were invading Afghanistan because they wanted to spread communism and maybe get a warm water port and on and on and on. And that isn't really quite right. They actually, there's now documentary evidence. They have the minutes of the Politburo meetings. They know the discussion that went on. And it's really much more that they were afraid of the US gaining influence in the neighboring country and that would be dangerous for them. And they also had a strong instinct, many of the leaders, that they were getting into a quagmire and they just couldn't stop themselves, which is just like what happened to us in Vietnam. So you start thinking, well, that's interesting. I had this view of it as this still totalitarian empire where they just wanted to conquer and they were just intrinsically aggressive and they just wanted to spread their evil system. And that actually wasn't their motivation and wasn't what happened. And we now know it. So this is all sort of piling up in my brain. And I started coming up with just a kind of a set of ideas about what the Soviet Union was and how that differed from what I thought it was. And the fact that was repeating now with Russia, not with me, but with our culture in general, that our culture was starting to vilify Russia, turn Putin into a one-dimensional character. Everything we'd done before, we were doing it again. And then I got a call from a friend who still worked at the CIA who asked me to come give a lecture there. And I said, okay, that's interesting. Let me think about it. And I thought, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk into the CIA and I'm going to tell them they have the Soviet Union wrong and they probably have Russia wrong today. It may not be that popular, but it'll be sort of interesting. It'll be a little bit funny. And also, if I'm being honest about it, they're pretty open in my experience there. They want to be challenged. So I thought it'd be great. So I got the whole thing ready and I wrote an outline. I had about a 3-page outline for the speech. And I called my friend back and I said, okay, I'm ready. And he said, great. The topic of your speech is counterintelligence. And I was like, the topic of my speech is Soviet Union and Russia. He said, no, it's counterintelligence. This is a lecture series on counterintelligence. And I said, well, you didn't tell me that. And I don't know anything about counterintelligence. So I didn't give the speech and I started walking around feeling disappointed. And that's when I thought, naively, I thought, I'll just make it a book. I already got the outline. and that was that. You know, if you had asked me then how long it would take, I would say I would knock it out in a year. And it took me about 5 years.
So, I mean, I guess that certainly begs the question. First of all, have you had a chance to actually give that speech that you prepared to the CIA since subsequently?
No, the speech has not been given.
So it remains to be given. Actually, one of my questions later on will be what kind of reactions you've gotten from policymakers, but we can get to that in a moment. I actually want to kind of ask you a question, looking at a little bit of the historical kind of linear pathway when it comes to the Soviet Union and Russian history. You know, one of the interesting things is that you do in the book is that you don't simply focus on contemporary issues in Putin, but you actually go back a little bit in time, not necessarily to the czars, but to Stalin. And you spend a lot of time thinking through and trying to disaggregate, you know, what were some of the aspects to Stalin that were bad, that were counterproductive, that were harmful. But you also try to do, you know, take a balanced perspective and sort of say, well, where have we gotten it wrong when it comes to some of the things that Stalin did, such as pushing back and really contributing to the defeat of Nazi Germany, among other things, or its rapid industrialization, even in the midst of starvation and famines, and so on. And you know, and one of the through lines, I think, if you kind of look to the czars beforehand, Stalin as captured in your book, and then Putin right now, is that there is this sort of consistent pattern of the strongman when it comes to leadership in Russia. And I'd be curious whether there's something there to sort of think about, either because we make assumptions about Russians and their sort of desire for a certain type of system, and maybe in fact, you know, as their history shows, you know, what they're looking for politically is different than what we may think is good for them or what they want. But can you talk a little bit about that sort of pattern, that through line of strongman leadership, and how that adds up to your own kind of understanding and what you've captured in the book?
Yeah. Let me say a few things about that, and then dip into Stalin for a little bit. But I'll start by mentioning something about my mother, because I was just talking earlier to someone about this, really like an hour ago, that my mother, who was literally one of the most wonderful, great ladies in the world, I don't want to be misunderstood, but somebody described her once as not really getting that people were different from each other, which I thought was like, there was a lot of truth to it. She sort of, some part of her just assumed that all people functioned the same way she did and thought the same thing she did. And then if they didn't, she thought something was going wrong. And I think that's fairly common. And I actually think I used to be like that too. I think there's very easy to grow up with a sort of root assumption that your brain and your way of being in the world is the right way. And so if other people, you assume other people want to be the way you are. And if they don't, it doesn't add up. So as a nation, we have tended to have this belief that first the Soviet Union and now Russia wants Western liberal democracy. I certainly believed that myself for years. It seemed obvious. I didn't even need to prove it to myself. It was obvious that we had the best, most enlightened system, and anybody who didn't want it would have it. But that is not accurate, right? You know, one of the most interesting things I discovered when I was sort of reassessing all my views about the Soviet Union was that the dissidents, who we talked about all the time in the United States, and who were heroes to us, and who I thought represented what almost everybody in the Soviet Union thought but was afraid to say. That's what I thought about the dissidents. No, they were not popular. They were not popular in the Soviet Union. They were a small fringe that people didn't care about and didn't like. And now that the Soviet Union is gone, it's very easy for people to be more open. They're not popular now. They're not looked back on by any great number of people with fondness or as heroes. And this, of course, ties into what you're saying, that there has always been a different system there. It has always relied to various degrees on, strong man type leaders. We could talk forever about why this might be. Some of it is historical precedent. Masha Gessen has written some, really convincing and great stuff about how a strong authoritarian leader essentially relieves you of anxiety because you don't have to make decisions. They're made for you. Well, if you take you can be judgmental or not about that, but it makes sense and it's true and it's thoughtful, and it would be a perfectly valid reason for a lot of people to sort of lean towards strongman leaders and authoritarian systems. And it's more complicated than that too. But, from my understanding, I don't speak fluent Russian and I haven't been there in a long time, but I read a lot and talk to a lot of people who are there. And my understanding from that is that even the word democracy doesn't have a particularly positive ring to people in Russia. They're not going around using that word to indicate something they necessarily want or think is great. So in that context, you have to start sort of rethinking the whole project that we had in relationship to the Soviet Union, because it was all about trying to basically defeat a communist system and liberate it. We wanted to liberate them. Then we've backed off from that to some degree with modern day Russia, but underneath a lot of our actions and activities and hostility, I think is that same assumption. So now I'll go back to Stalin for 1 second. The thing that really fascinated me about Stalin, now here's one of the great killers in history, one of the great, brutal, murderous, horrendous leaders with his, a Hitler level death toll. I mean, just unbelievable. And yet he was enormously popular at the time, and he is enormously popular in Russia today. How can that be? Right? In the Soviet era, you could it probably wasn't quite true, but it also wasn't untrue either. So you could make the case that his popularity was related to the fact that people didn't know all the things that he was doing, right? And even if they knew what was going on, they often made excuses and thought it was going on behind his back. You can't say that now. People in Russia know. The history is open, it is out there, it's all been revealed. And yet I think something like half the people in Russia consider him one of the great leaders of all time and say that they admire and respect him. How do you make sense of that when it was their own ancestors that he was butchering, right? So to me, that was a great kind of conundrum. And in order to try to figure it out, I had to do something that was uncomfortable, which is look at not just the butchery, which I'd studied my whole life, and which is, you could easy to learn that. I mean, it's horrible, but it's easy to learn it. But I had to look at what he might have done that was positive or that people liked. And as you mentioned, some of these things, from industrializing the country to essentially being the true father of the country, really more than Lenin. Lenin was maybe intellectually the father of the country, but Stalin really built it up and turned it into a whole country. He also brought millions of people out of like rural poverty and sent them to universities. If you think about people like that, it's not surprising that generations later, people would still appreciate him and support him for that. So there were, I think as an American, it's initially hard to understand that somebody who acted like that was popular. But then the question I asked myself was, well, I don't know. What if you go back in American history? We had leaders too who were slaveholders. We had leaders who butchered Native Americans, and there are heroes. So maybe it's not so strange.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things one of the uncomfortable things that your book does is it does force us to kind of scrutinize our own actions and sort of say, before we, promote and extol the virtues of American democracy, we are still struggling to come to terms with our own past legacy, and that, we need to look internally as much as we kind of lecture people externally as well. That it's an important part of the role. I want to jump to a question about, kind of the current difficulties we have with Putin. And so, one of the kind of big recommendations from your book is that we need to find a way to engage with Putin. We need to find a way to, seek common ground. Maybe it's possible, maybe it isn't, but we've made a lot of mistakes, and we've crossed Putin in ways as much as he's crossed us, and that part of the disentanglement of that is the only way forward. And I'm curious because, it reminded me of, early in the Obama administration, a similar attempt under Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, the big Russia reset button, to sort of, say, let's turn our backs on this neocon George W. Bush kind of Cold War mentality, and let's try to see if there is a way for us to do deals. Like, we don't have to love each other, we don't have to be best friends, but we can find a way to find areas of common ground, and not to have large problems, large quarrels. And as we know, as we can see right now, that ultimately ended up being a pretty big failure for a lot of reasons. So tell me a little bit about why that didn't work, but why something along those lines might succeed in this current climate.
I think that when you look at the various resets, they have this sort of optimistic idea that we can maybe start over and do better and get along. But I'm only speaking from the American point of view. I don't even know from the Russian point of view. From the American point of view, I think there tends to be a root assumption that what's really getting reset is their behavior, because these resets tend to fall apart as soon as we don't like something they do, right? If they pass anti-gay legislation, or if they invade another country or whatever, then the reset's over because they have returned to form and we don't want to get along with them anymore. I think the kind of reset I would argue for, now you asked me why this would work, I don't know that this would work, and I don't know that it will happen. So I'm saying this more because I think it's a good idea than a practical idea. But the kind of reset I would believe in is a reset of our own attitudes, how we look at them and how we think about them, so that we stop blaming them for everything that's wrong in our relationship. We stop viewing them as the aggressors towards us. We stop seeing ourselves as their victims. I'll give you a practical example of this. There's no question that the Russian government interfered heavily in our electoral process, and more broadly in our sort of political process and society and cultural in general, through all kinds of propaganda, social media campaigns, intelligence operations, etc. Obviously that happened. So one way to look at that is they're attacking us. They're trying to destroy good. They're bad autocrats trying to destroy good democracy. Another way to look at it is, maybe we have behaved the same way towards them. Maybe we have provoked them. Maybe going back to the Soviet era, we obviously were trying to destroy the Soviet Union. I mean, there were secret presidential national security directives directly saying that we wanted to undermine the Soviet Union as best we could. And although I don't think it is done in a sort of a secret intelligence finding with Russia, all you have to do is listen to all of our presidents and most of our leading politicians to understand that they think Russia should not be the kind of government it is and should not be run by Putin. And they put their money where their mouth is and have done all sorts of things, funding groups inside Russia that share our values, for example. Well, that's interfering in their politics too. So now the list of things that we've done towards them is much longer than that. And the list of things they've done to us is much longer than that. But it's really a tit for tat, a back and forth, a bad habit we're in of fighting each other. And I think if we could reset how we think about it, from everything they do is wrong and everything we do is right, to we're just locked in a sort of unhealthy back and forth, then I think we could maybe start to change things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So here's a more direct question about Putin. There's a few theories about kind of why he has the antagonism that he does against the U.S. I mean, one of which is that it has less to do with the U.S. than a larger grievance about the demise of the Soviet Union, of which he blames the U.S., but also others for that. And in which case, then, whatever actions the U.S. were to take, it seems like those would be minimal. Others are that he specifically is aggrieved by specific program policies the U.S. undertook, whether it's the enlargement of NATO or so forth, so that there would be a way to unwind that. And then the third is that at this point, Putin is so far gone in terms of his irritation and antagonism against America that no matter what we would do, would be viewed merely as a sign of weakness and a rationale for Putin to exploit even further division or perceived weakness in U.S. policy as a way to bolster Russia. No one knows exactly how all this would play out. Probably each one of these different theories has some truth to it. But I'm curious, in your opinion, as you lay out in the book, why do you think that some of the ideas you mentioned, the easing of sanctions, for example, wouldn't merely be viewed by Putin as a sign of weakness, but something that would actually lead to some reciprocity?
Right. Well, I'll go back in time a little bit to when Putin became president. And he did not seem driven by all of those things the way he does now. He seemed reasonably open to the West. He seemed to want to have economic cooperation. He wasn't bad-mouthing the West constantly. He was very genuinely and I think emotionally supportive after September 11. Some people point out that that was in his interest to have a sort of allies in the war on terror because he was fighting Chechnya and thought that would accrue to his advantage. But nevertheless, he let us fly over Russian airspace. He didn't make any problems about us having military bases in Central Asia. And there was just a general feeling of more openness to the West and some goodwill. And that started to crumble over the years, I would say pretty obviously in response to things. You mentioned the expansion of NATO, right? That's the United States expanding our defense alliance first into the former Warsaw Pact countries and then into former Soviet republics. Well, if you're Russia and you're Putin and your country has a history of being encircled and attacked, or even not, no country really feels comfortable with a defense alliance formed to fight them getting closer and closer to their border, right? Of course he felt encircled. So that's one example. There are plenty of other examples from us putting up a missile shield to all the sanctions, which are attack on their economy. It seems to me that pretty clear that Putin has undergone a change. And as a result of the change, if you look at things like whatever resentment he might have carried about the demise of the Soviet Union, we don't know what's in his heart, so we can't answer that. But it seems to me that that is more likely to be true now than it was, in 2010. Who knows for sure? If you ask, you say that, what do I think? Why do I think that easing sanctions and things like that would make a difference? I don't know that they would. I asked that same question in my book. He may be too far gone. He maybe but to me, the fact that he once was more open to the West and that he seems to have, the way he speaks, a kind of realpolitik side to him, I mostly think it's worth trying, right? As an example, getting rid of sanctions, I don't think that there's any real cost to that. First of all, if you wanted to, you could always put them back, right? Second of all, I don't know what good they're doing in the first place. So to let go of sanctions and just see, is there some kind of response? Or if there's no response and you do one other goodwill gesture, does the mood and feeling start to shift? You raised the question of, well, it would just be seen as a sign of weakness. I'd be interested in your view on this as a foreign policy expert. I tend to get suspicious when I hear that will be a sign of weakness, because I've noticed in whatever area of the world the US is active in, that same argument comes up. You can't be more conciliatory, you can't be more open because the enemy only understands strength, right? I think you probably remember that from the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. It was a very prevalent way of looking at the Middle East. And I tend to think, look, who knows, but I don't see any actual concrete evidence that conciliation is necessarily seen as weakness by anybody. What do you think of that?
I think it depends. I think it's context specific. I mean, with Putin, there's enough of a history at this point. I mean, the waters are poisoned enough that I don't trust him. I think the massing of 100,000 troops unprovoked in Ukraine right now, the assassination campaigns that you mentioned, the locking up of Navalny, among many others, all the different things that you lay out very well in your book, um, I think an unsolicited sort of freebie given to them without some kind of assurance that you're getting something for it uh, is unlikely to go far. In other words, I think we can find ways to deal with Putin transactionally. And I think that if we put our diplomacy on that track where we don't necessarily worry as much on the value side, because I think that's too far gone when it comes to U.S. Russian relations, but that we look at it purely in transactional terms, I think that potentially can bear some fruit. That being said, I think we're at such a moment of tension right now that it's hard to say exactly what the right move is, but certainly, it's a funny moment where, like, right now, the idea of showing a slightly weaker hand in the hopes that that would then get reciprocity, maybe in a couple months, but at this juncture, it feels very fraught. Um, Let me ask you a question. I want to take a few from the audience because there's a number of interesting points that people have raised. So one of them is, in the 5 years that took you to bring your book to fruition, how much revision was required because of the changing nature of U.S.-Russian relations? In other words, did you have to revise a bit, rethink some different aspects as shifts occurred?
That's a really interesting question because, so much happens all the time in our relationship with Russia. And I would say that about 90% of what I was writing about were kind of big picture historical trends that were not changing. But 10% was really detailed and of the moment. And I would sort of both constantly rewrite, but then as it became closer and closer time to publish the book, I was like, in the year between you hand the book in and this comes out, this could seem idiotic. It could be so wrong because of things that happen. So I started trying to write to cover myself for that. I started literally writing the book. Navalny might be dead by the time this comes out, right?
And I remember that very clearly, saying, I hope not, but Joe could be right.
Yeah. And then one of the most, I thought one of the most interesting things that happened that required substantial addition was when Navalny, was arrested and or poisoned, and essentially along with that media service, Bellingcat did this investigation where they really proved that the Russian intelligence services were behind it. That was something that there was, plenty of reason to suspect, but you couldn't prove it. And it was, I thought, also hard to know for sure if this was, rogue elements, or if it was not rogue elements, but maybe didn't go all the way to the very top. Well, that all got changed and proved I thought very conclusively. So I really had to go in and put that all in and then hold my breath that things wouldn't change too much over the next few months.
Yeah. No, it is a danger. Absolutely. When you write about current events, things can really just upend. But I thought you actually did a really good job of, hedging as you needed to, especially with some of those thornier issues. Another question from the audience, and I encourage you you all to continue sending if you have questions for Joe. We're coming to time, but we have a little bit of time left. So one is, the U.S. is no stranger to coddling autocrats. I think of Saudi Arabia, and your book suggests we need to be friendlier to Putin. Is he an okay potential ally despite his undemocratic ethos?
I think the answer to that is that the challenge is not necessarily to have Putin or Russia as an ally. It is to not be in a dangerous conflict with them. So that's a different bar, right? If somebody's to be your best friend, maybe you do care about all sorts of details about how they behave inside their own country and whatnot, because you don't want to take on responsibility for that. But if the goal is to essentially not fight with somebody, not to create problems, not to start wars, not to have proxy battles that get other people killed, I think that's a lower bar. I think they, basically should be able to have any kind of government they want. And obviously one of the great ironies of the Cold War, as this person I think is pointing out when they talk about coddling autocrats, is that in retrospect, and many people understood this at the time as well, a lot of our allies at the time and governments we were supporting were much more brutal than the Soviet Union. I mean, by a substantial factor. So, that's really a lesson and a warning about, who you're going to ally yourself with and what side you're going to take. But I tend to think that that a government's job of our government, any government, is to create peace and to avoid conflict and get along with other countries. And that what means is you don't go in and tell them how to run their countries or how to live their lives. I think that private individuals, great organizations like Amnesty International, they can play that role and should play that role and do play that role. And they're good at it because they are consistent. They go after, Amnesty International goes after human rights abuses in every country. It doesn't matter. So that they're able to be consistent in a way that your government can't be, because your government will never go after itself.
Yeah. I'm going to show my cards a little bit in that when I worked in the State Department, I was part of the division of the State Department that argued the more we lectured countries and try to push them on democracy, the better off our national interests would be. So I come at it from a slightly different perspective, but I think, look, honestly, you're reflecting a split in that, many would say precisely what you did from a pretty realist perspective, which is that interests predominate. We have little business telling other countries how to run their affairs. Think about maintaining peace, but don't go beyond what your mandate is. Others would argue that there's a moral imperative to go in when you see injustice occurring, and that human rights and democracy are universal principles, not American principles, and that that part of the mistake of U.S. foreign policy has been precisely to ally ourselves with people like Mubarak, in Egypt, and a host of others in a variety of places, and that we should have been more on the side of justice. But this is not an argument that's resolved. It's very live, and so it is fair to kind of probe at it and push at it, and we should do that. There's two more. One sort of a question off topic, which I want to ask at the very end very quickly. But one more question, actually on disinformation that someone wrote. So can you comment about how the GRU sows chaos in American society, or at least past elections, through disinformation manipulation, and what to do to prevent it? So any thoughts? And you talk a little bit about kind of election manipulation. It's not the core argument of your book, but any thoughts on that front?
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting history of how the KGB used to do this in the Soviet era, because they, in a sense, tried to employ whatever techniques were available to them, disinformation, propaganda. They would, for example, forge letters and send them they'd forge a racist letter supposedly written by a Jewish organization, send it to a black organization in America, and think they were going to start a race war. They did all this stuff that was kind of very ham-fisted and almost laughable and didn't work or have any effect. And essentially, with the internet and growing sophistication and growing awareness on their part of how America really works, they're doing similar things now, but now it's working. It's no joke anymore. It's not funny. And to me, the tricky thing is it's essentially impossible to know the effect it's having. Maybe it's been really fundamental to creating some of the problems we're having, and maybe it's barely had any effect at all. In general, it seems to me we're responsible for our own internal struggles, no matter what. Even if it came from some part from propaganda, it's still on us. So I tend to like a formulation I heard someone else say, pretty simple, but I think true formulation, that essentially they're pouring fuel on a fire. So the fire is already burning, but you don't want fuel poured on it.
Yeah, the fire's definitely burning.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you, and frankly, I think there was a moment around the 2016 election where Russian disinformation campaigns really felt like they were doing something substantive when it came to interfering with their democracy. I don't think with 2020, with the conspiracy theories that have arisen, with the January 6th insurrection, that has anything to do with Russia. That is our own polarization that we need to work on. And I think blaming Russia is a distraction. It takes us away from the core work that needs to occur. Okay, so last question for you. It is a non-Russia question, but I thought it was kind of amusing, which is that I'd love to know what Joe thinks about other dramatized spy thrillers. Are you a fan of some of the other like Bond films, or are they too over the top? Given in particular, how gritty and realistic and emotionally engaging the Americans were.
Yeah.
So any reactions to that question?
Well, asking me if I like Bond films is almost like asking me if I liked my childhood. It's like when I was a kid, I watched every single one, and they made me want to be a spy. And it was like I loved every second of those movies. And that's not to even mention the like sexuality, which I was an 11, 12-year-old watching the stuff, and I was like, well, that seems interesting too. It was my whole life. Somebody asked me who my favorite Bond was, and the truth is, when I was growing up, people were very snobby, and they all said, "Oh, Sean Connery is the only great Bond, and Roger Moore's so terrible." But I loved Roger Moore. I loved Roger Moore. He was my guy.
A
So
little
I
out of
admit,
shape, but
a little out of shape, but he had that savoir faire. He had that like something. He had that whatever it was. But he was to me the real Bond. I didn't want a realistic Bond. I didn't want him to emote like Sean Connery. But also, I thought all the Bonds were great, and I loved all the movies. I haven't seen the last few, which maybe says something. I was a big Homeland fan. I loved that show and watched every episode of that. They're asking about the dramatizations. I have always been a huge Le Carre fan. Who isn't? But I inhaled those books, and my own goal in being a spy was really not to be James Bond so much as George Smiley, which is a very weird thing to want to be, but I did.
Yeah, no, I can only just kind of imagine him and his own, world. I have to say that, as I've sort of become dispirited by our politics, I find myself increasingly turning to spy thrillers as a way to escape from the drudgery of our political life.
Yeah,
So
it's
I'm
not so
I'm certainly
bad.
with you. I'm certainly with you. Before I turn it, I think back over to Hollis to close. Let me ask: do you have any final comments you'd like to make about the book, uh, U.S.-Russia relations, otherwise, that I either haven't asked or you want to sort of say?
I guess the final thing I would say is that, I write a lot in the book about trying to divert my own energy from attacking and blaming others in the foreign policy realm to looking at my own country. And in the same vein, from attacking other individuals to looking at myself and thinking where I'm at and how I feel and what I can do. There's been a lot of great work recently by people sort of studying this question and making the point that we tend to all think that our politics come from our intellect, that we have ideas and beliefs and they are right and the other guys are wrong. But it's much more likely that politics are really emotionally based. And we come up with them because of what we're feeling. And after we have the beliefs, then we come up with ideas to justify them. And that's a very different way of looking at it. And I think very powerful because it takes away the notion that you're right and the other guy is wrong, and that your ideas are built on the true facts and theirs are built on illusions and lies. It's really more that all of you are just feeling different things, and you come up with some ideas, and then you come up with facts and ideas to support it. So I think it's just worth everybody exploring that in themselves and looking a little bit at how their politics might have come out of their families and feelings and fears and anxieties, and in doing so, stop being so convinced, whichever side of things you're on, that the other side is just flat wrong.
I think that's a good way to end. I couldn't agree more when it comes to the emotional appeal of politics being at the core of what's driving some of our problems right now. Well, Joe, I really want to thank you for talking about your fascinating book, which I advise you all to. It makes a great holiday gift, even if it's a slightly heavy reading. But thanks for making the time, for talking about your career, for talking about lots of tough issues. I really appreciate it. And I think we'll turn it over to Hollis to wrap up with some final words.
Thank you, Steve. It was great talking to you. I really enjoyed that conversation.
Yeah.
Fascinating discussion. Thanks so much. I just wanted to let our audience know that if you haven't seen The Americans, it's available on Amazon Prime Video. So it's fabulous, fabulous series, and you should definitely make the time to watch it. I would like to thank Steve and Anne and Joe for joining us this evening. We hope you all have enjoyed the conversation, and we will we'll reach out to you for information on our future events. A quick teaser, we have an event January 6th with Ty Sigil, author of Robert E. Lee and Me. It's a personal story that explores the problems that can arise when we, the people, don't believe the same facts. So hope you can join us. That concludes tonight's program. Thank you again for joining us.